The Empire first saw the human ship drift across the quiet edge of their domain, where the stars glowed faint and the borders stretched thin like old threads of silk. It was not a vessel built for beauty, nor for intimidation. Its hull bore scars and burns from travel across regions unknown to the Empire, marks of journeys that suggested struggle, yet endurance. The patrol officers who watched from their own ships prepared for the usual scene that came when small species strayed too close, for they had seen this pattern many times before, a frightened crew sending signals of surrender or confusion, a desperate attempt to flee or hide, and always the inevitable fear in their voices. Yet this time was different. The ship moved without haste, not rushing nor stalling, simply drifting as if it belonged wherever it chose to be. The scanners picked up life inside: steady pulses, steady breathing, no signs of panic. The Empire officers thought perhaps their readings were broken, so they ran them again, and again the results unchanged: calmness, steady as stone wind. The boarding signal was sent. The humans responded with a single message received. The voice that carried across the channel was measured and clear, without stammer, without tremble. The officer on duty frowned, for this was not how it was supposed to begin. They were the Empire, the feared, the unmatched rulers of stars. Entire civilizations had bowed at the mere sound of their summons, but these humans did not bow and did not cry. The boarding began with full procedure. Soldiers in polished armor marched into the vessel, weapons ready, faces set with practiced severity. They expected resistance or pleading or the chaos of weak minds facing power, but when the humans appeared there was none of this. They stepped forward in simple clothing, their hands visible, their eyes steady. They looked at the soldiers not with defiance, not with submission, but with a calm that unsettled the entire squad. The leader of the boarding crew found his voice rough in his throat. He announced that the humans were now under the custody of the Empire and would be brought before the council. It was the same speech he had given a dozen times before, yet this time he felt unsure of his own words. The humans listened without reaction. When he finished, they nodded once, not in fear, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if hearing the words of a neighbor rather than a conqueror. The journey back to the Empire capital was silent. The humans asked no questions, they showed no signs of worry. They gazed out at the endless stars as though they had seen them all before, as though nothing here could surprise them. The soldiers who guarded them grew uneasy, whispering among themselves about what these humans might be hiding. Perhaps they had weapons invisible to scanners, perhaps. Their calm was an act meant to lure them into false confidence. But none could explain why their presence felt heavier than any army. By the time the ship approached the capital world, the unease had spread through every rank. The Empire was ready to receive another broken species, but what awaited them instead were humans whose serenity cut deeper than fear itself. The Imperial Guards were prepared for a scene they had lived through many times before. For them, every new encounter with a young and wandering species followed the same rhythm: fear, confusion, pleading for mercy. These were the notes of the song they expected to hear. Yet when the humans were escorted from their vessel, the guards felt an unexpected weight settle over the bay. The humans stepped out one by one, their movements slow and deliberate, not sluggish but measured, as though each step had been chosen with courage. The commander of the guard watched closely, his eyes narrowed behind his visor. He had studied countless alien expressions over his years of service, and could usually read terror-like words on a page, but the humans gave him nothing. Their faces were calm, their breathing steady, their gaze level as they looked at the towering soldiers who surrounded them. It was not arrogance and it was not defiance. Instead, it was a quiet acceptance that unsettled the commander more than open rebellion would have. As the humans walked through the shining halls of the station, they did not ask questions. They did not whisper to one another in secret. They moved as though the halls belonged to them, or as though they had walked through such halls 1,000 times before. The soldiers around them exchanged uneasy glances. Some tapped their weapons nervously. Others glanced at scanners that showed no hidden weapons, no unusual energy fields, nothing that could explain the lack of fear. When they reached the docking platforms, thousands of citizens had gathered. The arrival of new species was always a spectacle. The Empire prided itself on showing its power before all who lived under its shadow. The citizens leaned over rails and platforms expecting screams, begging, or resistance. Instead, they watched a procession of humans who moved with serenity. Faces that should have twisted with dread showed only quiet, focused voices that should have cracked with fear spoke not a word at all. Children in the crowd pointed and whispered, wondering if these creatures were even alive, so calm were their movements. Traders muttered that they must be drugged, but the scanners denied it. Priests of the empire watched with frowns, convinced this was some omen, for no soul could remain untouched by the power of the empire, and yet these souls seemed untouched. The humans were brought before a waiting envoy, a towering alien, draped in robes, woven with silver light. He raised his staff and proclaimed in a voice that echoed through the chamber that the empire had claimed them, and they would stand trial before the High Council. The words were ritual spoken 1,000 times before, yet as they rang out across the chamber, the humans did not tremble. They listened as though hearing nothing more than an announcement of weather. They did not protest, they did not resist, they simply remained calm for the first time in many years. The envoy faltered, his words trailed into silence, as he searched for some reaction, some hint of fear or submission, yet the humans gave him none. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and in that silence even the citizens began to feel a shiver run through them. They had come to witness the empire break another species. Instead they watched the empire itself grow uneasy in the face of calmness it could not shatter. The vast chamber of the High Council was a place built to break spirits. Every wall glimmered with shifting light, every column stretched higher than the eye could follow, and every surface echoed with the voices of the empire. When new species were dragged into this hall, they were meant to feel smaller than dust and weaker than ash. The floor itself was carved from stone, pulled from the heart of dying stars, and the ceiling was painted with the empire crest, a symbol that had stood for countless ages. The arrival of humans was meant to follow this pattern, the moment where they would crumble and plead. Yet, as the great doors opened, the humans walked inside as if entering a simple meeting place. Their steps were even, and their faces calm. They glanced at the immense statues of alien conquerors carved from crystal. They looked at the glowing banners that celebrated victories across the stars, and they gave no sign of fear. They did not whisper, they did not hesitate, they simply moved forward, as though the grandeur before them held no weight. The citizens who filled the side balconies leaned forward with sharp interest. They had seen cowering creatures collapse on this floor begging for mercy. They had seen rulers laugh as prisoners screamed. Yet what they saw now unsettled them more than any cry could have. The humans were steady. Their breathing was slow, their eyes were clear, and their bodies did not shake. A hush began to fall over the crowd as confusion rippled through their ranks. High Council itself sat upon thrones carved into a raised platform, each ruler towering in garments woven with threads of light. Their voices thundered across the chamber, demanding the humans kneel before the empire. The words struck like waves against stone, but the humans did not bend, they did not kneel, they did not even shift. Instead they stood together as if the demand had not been spoken at all. The rulers exchanged glances, their tones rising sharper as they unleashed displays meant to crush spirits. Lightning danced through the air, great illusions of warships filled the chamber, flames of victory roared across the walls. The empire had broken entire civilizations with less, yet through it all, the humans stood motionless. One even closed their eyes and breathed as though they were standing under the shade of a quiet tree. Whispers surged through the balconies. Some aliens clutched at their robes, others covered their faces, for the calm of the humans was more frightening than any weapon. For what power must lie hidden behind such serenity that no threat, no illusion, no display of force could move them at last? One of the rulers demanded to know who they were and what they sought. The human leader stepped forward and spoke with a voice that carried through the vast hall. "We come to understand." The words were not shouted, but the stillness that followed rang louder than any cry ever had. In that stillness something shifted. The council felt it, the citizens felt it, the gods felt it, a seed of doubt planted deep within the empire itself. The grand chamber was designed to overwhelm every sense. It pulsed with color and light that shifted like storms across the walls. It echoed with the sound of drums and horns that told of victories past. It smelled of burning incense drawn from the sacred roots of conquered worlds. The empire had built this place not only as a seat of judgment but as a weapon of fear, for no species had ever stood within it and remained whole. The rulers knew this, and the citizens believed it with every breath. When the humans did not bend, the rulers chose to escalate. The sky above the chamber shifted into vast illusions. Armadas of imperial warships appeared, hanging above the crowd, each larger than mountains, each bristling with weapons of devastating power. The chamber floor trembled as projections of entire cities crumbled beneath imperial conquest. The rulers watched the faces of the humans, expecting cracks to form, expecting the calm to break. Yet the humans only stood silent, their eyes reflected the storm of light and fire, but their bodies remained still. The crowd stirred uneasily. The citizens who had gathered to enjoy a spectacle of dominance now felt the weight of something they could not name. The collusions that once inspired pride now seemed desperate attempts at intimidation. The silence of the humans seemed heavier than the thunder of drums. A whisper began to spread from mouth to mouth. What if these creatures are not afraid, because they have faced worse? What if they carry within them a strength the Empire has never seen? The rulers grew agitated, their commands grew louder, their illusions sharper. Flames rose higher around the chamber, shadows of colossal beasts swept across the walls, soldiers stomped their feet in unison, trying to shake the ground beneath the humans, yet nothing changed. The humans simply stood still. One raised their eyes to the shifting sky above, and for a moment smiled as though reminded of something far away. That smile spread unease like wildfire through the hall. Delegates whispered to one another. Some leaned away from the balcony rails, clutching at their robes. Others glanced nervously toward the exits, for fear had not fallen upon the humans, it had fallen upon the Empire itself. The calmness of these strangers seemed unbreakable, and that unbreakable calm was beginning to crack the confidence of the rulers. The High Council tried one last tactic. The central throne rose higher above the floor, a towering presence meant to remind all who watched of the absolute supremacy of the Empire. The supreme ruler himself spoke, his voice rolling like thunder across the chamber. He declared that the humans must kneel not only for their own survival, but for the survival of their world. The words shook the chamber yet again. The humans did not bow. Their leader raised a hand slightly and answered, "We bow to no throne. We kneel to no fear." The chamber fell silent, the illusions faded, the drums stopped, even the flames froze in still images. The citizens who had come expecting a show of Empire strength realized they were witnessing something else. They were watching their rulers face a force that could not be measured by armies or fleets. They were watching Serenity itself become the most terrifying power, and in that silence the Empire began to tremble. The High Council sat in uneasy silence after the words of the human leader echoed through the chamber. The councillors were accustomed to roars of fear, to cries of submission, to the desperate bargains of weaker species, but never to this quiet and steady refusal. They shifted upon their thrones, their garments of woven light rippling, as they searched for answers that would not come. The air itself seemed heavy, the silence pressing down more than the sound of any weapon. At last one of the councillors broke the silence, demanding again that the humans state their purpose and their intent. Their voice rose high, reverberating across the walls, yet even that thunder could not mask the unease within it. The humans stood close together, and their leader spoke once more. His voice carried calm and weight. "We seek only to understand." These words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a comet. The crowd stirred, for it was not a declaration of conquest nor a plea for mercy. It was something entirely outside the rhythm. The Empire had built its power upon the citizens whispered among themselves. Could it be true? Could this new species stand unshaken before the Empire, not because they wished to fight, but because they wished only to learn? The notion spread like fire, and the whispers became louder. Some suggested that these humans must be hiding a terrible weapon, and others said the weapon was already before them, for their composure was unlike anything seen in the history of the Empire. Rulers tried again to break the silence. They promised wealth and protection if the humans would serve. They threatened annihilation if they would not. They painted images of both glory and destruction before their eyes, yet none of it stirred the humans. The promises were met with the same steady silence as the threats. No hunger for riches, no fear of death, no desperation for safety touched their faces. The citizens began to feel a shift inside themselves. Some felt anger at this defiance. Others felt awe. A few even felt shame for the Empire that needed illusions and threats to command respect, while these humans commanded presence without lifting a single weapon. The longer the silence stretched, the more it became clear that the balance of power in the room had shifted. It was no longer the Empire judging the humans, but the humans judging the Empire simply by standing unshaken. The supreme ruler tried one last time, leaning forward upon his throne and declaring that calmness without obedience was nothing more than arrogance, and that arrogance would be destroyed. The humans did not flinch. The leader of their group raised his eyes to the ruler and said, "We are not arrogant, we are simply unafraid." And those words landed like a blade of light cutting through the chamber. Every sound in the hall vanished. The crowd did not breathe, the rulers did not answer. For the Empire had never faced a foe who fought without weapons or words of defiance. The humans had offered only serenity, and that serenity had become the most dangerous truth. The words of the humans echoed far beyond the walls of the grand chamber. They spread into the streets of the capital, and into the listening posts of the outer colonies. They traveled through whispers among merchants and through the coded reports of soldiers. No matter how the Empire tried to frame the event, no matter how the officials announced that the humans were weak and insignificant, the truth could not be hidden. Those who had been present knew, and those who had heard the story. Second, Hens still felt the weight of it. The humans had not bent, they had not begged, they had not broken. Rumors grew like storms across the Empire. In the markets, traders muttered that the humans must have knowledge of secrets unknown to the council, and the temple's priests debated whether these strangers had been sent as omens by powers greater than the Empire itself. In the barracks, soldiers asked one another in hushed voices what kind of enemy stood calmly before threats that had shattered entire civilizations. The calm of the humans became a story retold and exaggerated, but the heart of it remained the same. They were unafraid. The rulers of the Empire gathered in private chambers, desperate to contain the tide. Some argued that the humans must be eliminated quickly before their presence spread doubt further. Others insisted that destruction would only prove the power of their calm, for martyrs often lived longer in memory than in flesh. A few whispered that perhaps the Empire should listen to the humans. Perhaps there was wisdom in that serenity, but such voices were quickly silenced, for they sounded too much like treason. The humans, meanwhile, were kept under watch in a secure wing of the palace. They did not resist their confinement. They accepted food and water without complaint. They spoke quietly among themselves, but their words carried no sign of fear or plotting. The guards assigned to them grew restless because there was nothing to report. They found themselves staring into the calm faces of the humans and feeling unease build in their own minds. At night, some guards dreamt of eyes that watched them without judgment, and they woke in cold sweat. The Empire had broken countless enemies with fire and steel, but this enemy offered no target to strike. How does one fight a calm that cannot be pierced? How does one defeat a silence that weighs heavier than thunder? The rulers could not answer, and the citizens began to wonder if perhaps the humans were stronger than the Empire itself, not in fleets or armies but in spirit. Whispers became questions, and questions became doubts. A merchant asked aloud in a crowded forum, "If the humans do not fear, then why do we?" The words spread like sparks across dry ground. Priests began to hesitate in their sermons. Soldiers began to wonder if their rulers were truly invincible. And through it all, the humans remained as they had been, calm, unshaken, untouched by the storms they had created around them. Empire had always ruled by fear, but now fear no longer bent the strangers. Instead, fear began to bend the Empire itself. The first cracks within the Empire appeared quietly, but they spread quickly like fractures in glass, unseen, until they became too large to ignore. Generals of the outer fleets gathered in secret to debate the nature of the humans. Some insisted that the strangers must be preparing for war and that their calm was a mask designed to unnerve the Empire. They pointed to history and declared that no species had ever walked into the heart of the Empire without trembling, unless they carried hidden strength. Others argued that the calm was not a mask, but a weapon in itself, that these humans had learned to wield serenity as others wielded blades. The council chambers filled with shouting voices. Some rulers demanded immediate annihilation. They spoke of mobilizing fleets and burning the human world to ash before their influence spread further. But other rulers hesitated, for they had seen the reaction of the citizens. They had seen how fear had begun to shift not toward the humans, but toward the Empire itself. They warned that if the humans were destroyed now, the citizens would remember them, not as enemies, but as figures of unbreakable strength, and the Empire would never wash away that memory in the streets of the capital. The whispers had grown into bold conversations. Merchants spoke openly that perhaps the Empire was not as strong as it seemed. Priests found themselves challenged during sermons by believers who asked why the gods had sent humans who could stand. Unshaken soldiers in the barracks sharpened their weapons not against outsiders, but against the shadows of doubt that crept into their own minds. The Empire had ruled for ages through fear, and yet here were humans who had walked into the seat of power without bowing, and somehow left the rulers themselves unsettled. Paranoia spread among the elite. Some believed the humans had powers of the mind unseen by scanners. Others whispered that they could bend reality itself with their silence. Still others suspected that the humans were working with forces beyond the known stars. The more the rulers tried to explain the calm, the deeper their fear grew, for none of the explanations satisfied the unease in their hearts. Meanwhile, the humans continued as they always had. They ate when food was given. They rested when allowed. They spoke little, but when they did, their words were simple and steady. they made no threats, they offered no bargains, they showed no signs of deception, and it was this lack of movement, this lack of hunger or fear that disturbed the empire more than open rebellion could have. For an enemy who shouts can be understood, and an enemy who fights can be measured, but an enemy who remains silent cannot be grasped. Began to question their orders. Some refused to move their fleets until they understood more. Others began building weapons in secret, convinced that war was inevitable. The council itself fractured into camps and alliances, each suspicious of the other, for the calm of the humans had become a mirror showing every crack in their empire, and through it all the humans remained as they were, unshaken and serene, while the empire trembled around them. The empire had always presented itself as eternal, unbreakable, and absolute, yet in the wake of the humans that image began to crumble within the minds of its own people. Debates raged across the chambers of government, across the halls of temples, and across the crowded markets of every great city for generations. Fear had been the foundation of order and obedience, but now fear itself seemed to belong not to the subjects of the empire, but to the rulers who were meant to command it. The High Council tried to hold unity, but the divisions were too deep. Some rulers argued that the humans must be courted and drawn into alliance to discover the source of their serenity. Others believed that the humans were already a disease that threatened to spread across the empire and must be eradicated before they infected more worlds. Voices clashed in heated meetings, accusations of weakness and cowardice flew freely, and trust among the rulers grew thinner with each passing day. The citizens, too, had become restless. In taverns and marketplaces, people spoke more boldly than ever before. They asked how the empire could be supreme if mere strangers could stand in the grand chamber and resist every display of power. Some whispered that the empire had grown hollow, that its strength was only illusion. Others whispered that perhaps the humans were messengers of something greater, and that resisting them might bring ruin upon all. The military felt the fractures most of all. Admirals argued over whether to prepare fleets for war or to hold their forces in reserve. Some began building secret coalitions, loyal not to the council but to their own vision of survival. A few even questioned whether they would obey if the order came to attack the human world, for obedience had always been rooted in fear. But if fear no longer worked, then loyalty itself began to waver. The humans remained silent in their confinement, and yet their silence became the loudest voice in the empire. Reports of their calm spread from system to system. Each retelling of the story grew sharper and more powerful. They were described as unmovable as statues, as unbreakable as mountains. Their stillness was painted as proof of hidden strength, and the myth of their serenity grew larger than the truth. The empire found itself unable to control the narrative, because every attempt to diminish the humans only made their composure seemed greater. Priests quarreled within temples. Some claimed that humans were heretics, others claimed they were prophets sent to test the empire. Some believers began to abandon the old gods in favor of silent prayers to the calm of humanity. Soldiers began to whisper that they would rather face fleets of warships than a handful of humans who would not bow. The empire was no longer united in its certainty. The day of departure arrived not without ceremony. The humans were escorted once more through the wide halls of the palace. The cracks in the empire no longer stood tall, but shifted uneasily. Alliances shifted trust of prisoners, and whispers of rebellion stirred. The citizens gathered in the plazas, hoping to see some sign that the strangers had finally broken from silence. They were met with the same quiet composure that had unsettled the empire from the very beginning. The humans walked as though every corridor belonged to them, as though the weight of empires was nothing more than dust upon their shoulders. When they reached the docks, the crowd expected at least one final declaration from the council, a warning or a threat or a promise of war. Instead, the rulers remained silent, watching from high balconies with eyes that betrayed more fear than pride. Their illusions had failed, their threats had failed, their power itself had failed. In the face of serenity, they could not summon the voice to speak, for whatever they said would sound hollow compared to the stillness of the humans. The vessel that had brought the humans remained waiting, scarred and worn, yet steady like its passengers. They boarded without haste or hesitation, pausing only once to look upon the sea of faces staring back at them. That gaze lingered for a moment, and though not a single word was spoken, many in the crowd felt as if their souls were being weighed. The humans gave a nod, not of submission but of recognition, then disappeared into their shippas. The engines roared to life. A silence fell over the entire port. The citizens who had gathered to witness conquest realized They were witnessing something else entirely. They were watching a species leave, not in chains, not in terror, but in serenity, greater than the empire itself. Some felt awe, others felt dread, and many felt a strange stirring in their hearts. A thought that perhaps fear was not the only path to survival. Perhaps serenity itself was a power, stronger than weapons. When the ship vanished into the stars, the council tried to declare the matter closed. They announced that the humans were insignificant, that their calm meant nothing, that the empire remained unshaken. Yet the words did not ring true. They did not echo as they once had. They fell flat upon ears already filled with a different memory. The memory of stillness unbroken by fire or thundercross. The empire stories of the humans continued to grow. Some told of their calm, as a shield that no force could pierce. Others claimed they could see into the hearts of rulers and reflect their weakness. A few began to believe the empire itself had already been conquered, not by armies or fleets, but by the weight of serenity. Humans left with nothing in their hands, no wealth, no treaties, no trophies, yet behind them they left an empire trembling at shadows, an empire that had been forced to see its own fragility in their silence. They had spoken louder than any war cry. In their calm they had delivered a wound that no blade could inflict, and so the empire that had bent countless worlds found itself bent by the quiet strength of humanity.